The following presentation is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen in this video. Imagine you're in a cold, damp cellar in the year 1750. The only light comes from a single sliver of a window high on the stone wall. In the corner there's a person. They are gaunt, filthy, and chained to the wall by their ankle. They rock back and forth, muttering words no one can understand. This isn't a prison. This is their home. And this, for hundreds of years, was mental health care in America. It was a private horror, a family secret, locked away in the darkest corners of society. Now fast forward to today. You're trying to find a therapist who takes your insurance and doesn't have a 6-month waiting list. You're scrolling through social media, seeing a tidal wave of conflicting advice about anxiety and depression. You're wondering why, in a world of technological miracles, getting help for your mind feels so impossibly, frustratingly hard. Why is there still a whispers of shame, a stigma that clings to mental illness like a shadow? The answer to that question isn't found in a self-help book or a wellness app. The answer is buried in the past. It's in that cellar. It's in the horrifying treatments that were called medicine. It's in the towering, castle-like asylums that dot the American landscape, now lying in ruin. To understand the broken system we have today, and more importantly, to understand how to fix it for ourselves and for the future, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to uncover the shocking, tragic, and occasionally hopeful story of how America has treated its most vulnerable minds. This is the history of a silent battle, fought not on a field, but inside the human skull. And it's a story that affects every single one of us. In the early American colonies, there was no concept of mental illness as we know it. There were no psychiatrists, no therapists, no diagnoses like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. There was just madness. And madness was not a medical problem. It was a spiritual one. A person behaving erratically, hearing voices, or falling into a deep, unshakable melancholy was seen as being afflicted by one of three things: a test from God, a moral failing of their own, or most terrifyingly, demonic possession. The community's response was guided by fear and faith. The first line of treatment was prayer, fasting, and public shaming. If a person's behavior was disruptive, they might be whipped, dunked in freezing water, or locked in the town stocks, all in an attempt to shock their soul back into a state of piety. This wasn't necessarily born of pure cruelty. It was born of a profound and terrifying misunderstanding. They were trying to save a soul they believed was in peril, using the only tools their worldview provided. But for the most part, the mad were not a public problem. They were a family problem. If your son, your wife, or your father descended into what was then called lunacy, they became your burden to bear, and your shame to hide. Families with the means would lock their afflicted relatives away in an attic room, a basement, or a small shed built in the backyard. They were fed, they were kept alive, but they were effectively erased from the world. For the poor, the situation was even more dire. With no resources to contain them, the mentally ill often became homeless wanderers, drifting from town to town, feared, mocked, and left to fend for themselves against the elements. They were the village idiots, the madmen, figures of folklore and cautionary tales. This was the system, a patchwork of private shame and public neglect. Then, as the colonies grew into a nation, a new idea began to take hold. It was a radical idea, born from the Enlightenment, that maybe madness wasn't a spiritual failing, but a physical one, a disease. And if it was a disease, then perhaps it could be treated. In 1751, a group of prominent citizens in Philadelphia, including Benjamin Franklin, petitioned the Pennsylvania legislature to create something the New World had never seen before: a hospital. The Pennsylvania Hospital was founded not just for the physically sick, but with a specific, groundbreaking purpose: to care for the sick, poor, and insane of the province. For the very first time, mental illness was being framed as a public medical responsibility. It was a noble idea. The reality was something else entirely. The mentally ill were not placed in sunny, restorative wards. They were herded into the hospital's basement, the cellar. They lived in small, dark, unheated cells with straw for a bed and a bucket for a toilet. They were chained to the walls or floors to prevent them from hurting themselves or others. There was no therapy, no attempt at understanding their condition. It was purely custodial. The goal was not to cure but to contain, to hide society's problem out of sight. The conditions were so appalling that the hospital's managers eventually decided to turn it into a spectacle to raise money. For a small fee, the well-to-do citizens of Philadelphia could come and tour the basement, to gawk at the patients in their cells like animals in a zoo. This dreadful entertainment, as one visitor called it, became a popular Sunday afternoon attraction. This was the birth of institutional mental health care in America, a basement dungeon funded by a human zoo. But even within this grim reality, a new breed of physician was emerging, determined to bring the full force of medical science to bear on the problem of the mind. And no one was more influential or more controversial than Dr. Benjamin Rush. A signer of the Declaration of Independence and one of the nation's most respected doctors, Rush is now called the father of American psychiatry. He was one of the first to adamantly argue that mental illness was a disease, not a sin. He believed it was an arterial disease, caused by an inflammation of the blood vessels in the brain. This was a revolutionary step forward, moving the conversation from the church to the laboratory. His treatments, however, were an absolute nightmare. Believing the brain was overstimulated, Rush's primary tools were designed to drain the body of energy and blood. He was a fervent advocate of bloodletting, sometimes draining pints of blood from a single patient. He used powerful purgatives and emetics to induce violent vomiting and diarrhea, believing it would cleanse the body of the disease. Patients were subjected to ice-cold baths for hours on end to reduce the brain's inflammation. But Dr. Rush was also an inventor. He created devices that sound like they belong in a medieval torture chamber. First, there was the tranquilizing chair. Patients were strapped into a special chair, their arms and legs bound, and a wooden box was placed over their head to block out all light and sound. They could be left like this for hours, sometimes days, in an attempt to subdue their agitation. Then there was the gyrator. This was a spinning board to which a patient was strapped, head down, and then spun at high speed until they became dizzy and nauseous. The theory being that the centrifugal force would redistribute the blood in their brain. It's easy for us to look back with horror, but in Rush's mind, he wasn't torturing his patients. He was treating them. He was applying the best medical science of his day to a terrible disease. His work, for all its brutality, cemented a crucial idea: that the mind could be broken, yes, but it could also perhaps be fixed. The problem was, America was growing. The small hospital basements and family cellars could no longer handle the sheer number of people deemed insane. A new solution was needed. Not just a room, not just a cellar, but an entire building. A massive specialized institution built with a single purpose: to house and treat the mentally ill. A new word entered the American vocabulary, one filled with both hope and dread: the asylum. A new era was dawning, promising beautiful, peaceful sanctuaries designed to heal the mind. And what began as a noble dream would, for tens of thousands of Americans, become the defining nightmare of their lives. To understand the asylum, you first have to understand the dream. Imagine a place not of confinement, but of liberation. A sprawling estate, nestled in the countryside, far from the chaotic clang of the industrializing city. Picture grand, ornate buildings with high ceilings and large windows, designed to let in the maximum amount of sunlight and fresh air. Manicured lawns, gardens bursting with flowers, farms where patients could engage in the simple, honest labor of tilling the soil. Libraries filled with books, workshops for learning a trade, halls for music and dance. This wasn't a prison. It was a sanctuary, a meticulously designed environment built on a radical, almost breathtakingly optimistic idea: that madness wasn't a permanent stain on the soul, but a temporary illness that could be cured. And the cure wasn't chains or punishment, but kindness, order, and beauty. This philosophy was called moral treatment. It was a revolutionary concept, born out of the Enlightenment's faith in reason and human dignity. Pioneered in Europe by figures like Philippe Pinel in France and the Quaker William Tuke in England, it argued that the mentally ill were not beasts to be tamed, but broken people who needed help to find their way back to reason. The key was to remove them from the stressful environments that had caused their illness and place them in a structured, compassionate, and therapeutic community. For the first time, the goal wasn't just to confine the insane, but to heal them. This idea found fertile ground in the young, optimistic United States. The first institution to truly embrace it was the Friends Asylum, opened in 1817 outside Philadelphia. Run by Quakers, it was a world away from the almshouses and jails. Patients were treated as guests. They dined together, worked in the gardens, and were spoken to with respect. The results were astonishing. People who had been considered hopelessly, permanently insane began to recover. But this was a small, private institution for the wealthy. The vast majority of Americans had no access to such care. For them, the old horrors remained. To truly change the system, a new kind of medicine was needed, and it found its champion in a man who was, himself, a bundle of contradictions, Dr. Benjamin Rush. A signer of the Declaration of Independence, a friend to Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, Rush is often called the father of American psychiatry. He was the first to propose that mental illness was a disease of the brain, not a demonic possession or a moral failing. He argued passionately for humane treatment, for clean and well-regulated hospitals. He was a genuine reformer. But he was also a man of his time, and his methods were, by our standards, terrifying. Dr. Rush believed that madness was caused by an inflammation of the brain, an excess of blood that created a kind of cerebral hypertension. The logical cure then was to relieve that pressure. He became a fervent advocate for bloodletting, sometimes draining a patient of more than half their blood. He prescribed powerful purgatives like mercury to violently cleanse the body. He invented a device called the tranquilizing chair, a horrific contraption that bound a patient tightly, with a box over their head to block out all light and sound, while cold water was poured over them. He designed a gyrator, a spinning board meant to jolt the brain's circulation back into order. In his mind, these weren't tortures. They were cutting-edge medical treatments, designed to shock the system back into a state of balance. Benjamin Rush embodied the central paradox of this new era. A profound, humane desire to cure, coupled with a terrifying ignorance of how the mind actually worked. His ideas, both the humane and the horrifying, laid the groundwork. But it would take another person, not a doctor or a politician, but a quiet, determined schoolteacher, to ignite a revolution. Her name was Dorothea Dix. In 1841, Dix volunteered to teach a Sunday school class at the East Cambridge Jail in Massachusetts. What she saw there shattered her world. In an unheated, foul-smelling basement cell, she found several mentally ill women locked away with common criminals. They were naked, chained to the wall, and living in utter filth. The jailer told her that the insane could not feel the cold. Dix knew this was a lie. She went home and began a journey that would consume the rest of her life. For 2 years, Dorothea Dix traveled across Massachusetts, meticulously and systematically documenting the conditions of the mentally ill. She went to every jail, every almshouse, every private home where the lunatics were hidden away. She filled notebook after notebook with calm, factual, and utterly devastating accounts. She described people locked in cages, closets, and cellars. She saw them chained, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She found them naked, starving, and wallowing in their own waste. Armed with this mountain of evidence, she crafted a powerful speech, a memorial, to the Massachusetts state legislature in 1843. As a woman, she could not deliver it herself. A male colleague had to read it for her. But her words landed like a bombshell. She wrote, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." The graphic, undeniable truth of her report shamed the legislature into action. They passed a bill to expand the state's mental hospital at Worcester. But for Dorothea Dix, this was just the beginning. She had found her calling. She became a force of nature, a one-woman crusade for the forgotten. For the next 40 years, she traveled the length and breadth of the country, from New Jersey to Illinois, from North Carolina to Louisiana. Her method was always the same: painstaking investigation followed by a powerful fact-based appeal to the state's most powerful men. And it worked. State after state was moved by her testimony, dedicating millions of dollars to build new hospitals for the insane. Her efforts directly led to the creation of more than 30 new institutions across the United States, and even into Europe. It was during this explosion of hospital construction that a new architectural philosophy took hold, one that perfectly matched the ideals of moral treatment. It was called the Kirkbride Plan. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a superintendent at a Pennsylvania hospital, believed that the very building itself could be a tool for healing. He designed a specific layout, a central administrative building flanked by long stepped-back wings, so that every single patient room had a window with a view of nature and access to fresh air. The wings were segregated by gender and by the severity of the patient's illness. The most agitated patients were housed on the ends of the wings, farthest from the central building, so their disturbances wouldn't affect the others. As patients improved, they would literally move closer to the center of the hospital, closer to recovery and society. The Kirkbride asylums were magnificent, imposing structures. Built to last for centuries with slate roofs, stone walls, and towering spires, they were often the largest buildings in their entire state. They were symbols of civic pride, monuments to a society's compassion and scientific progress. From the 1840s to the 1880s, this was the golden age of the asylum. For a brief, shining moment, the dream seemed to be working. Thousands of people entered these palaces of healing, and with a regimen of rest, healthy food, meaningful work, and kindness, they recovered. They went home. The Kirkbride plan, fueled by the moral crusade of Dorothea Dix, seemed to be the final enlightened answer to the ancient problem of madness. The blueprint for utopia had been drawn. The palaces were being built. But as the doors swung open to welcome the afflicted, they also began to close, locking away a much darker secret. The dream was about to be devoured by its own success. The first asylums were monuments to a new American optimism. They were built on the belief that the mind, like the nation itself, could be perfected. Early reports from superintendents read like dispatches from paradise. Patients, once chained in cellars, were now attending lectures, playing music, and tending gardens. The so-called cult of curability was in full swing. Doctors boasted of recovery rates as high as 80, even 90%. They believed they had cracked the code of human suffering. By removing a person from the chaos of modern life, the frantic pace of the city, the pressures of the factory, the anxieties of a rapidly changing world, and placing them in a structured, tranquil environment, the mind could heal itself. It was a beautiful theory, and for a brief, shining moment it seemed to work. But the world outside the asylum walls was not tranquil. The mid-19th century saw America convulsing with change. The Industrial Revolution was hitting its stride, pulling millions from farms into sprawling, anonymous cities. Families, once the primary caregivers, were fractured. In the tight quarters of a city tenement, there was no room and no time for a troubled mind. The asylum, once a place of last resort, became an answer to an increasingly common problem. It was a pressure valve for a society straining at the seams. Then came the waves of immigration. Millions arrived from Ireland, Germany, and later from Southern and Eastern Europe, fleeing famine and persecution. They were poor, they were different, and they were met with a toxic mix of fear and suspicion. A new and insidious idea began to take hold in the American consciousness, fueled by the burgeoning field of eugenics. The idea that poverty, criminality, and insanity were not products of circumstance, but were inherited traits. They were seen as defects in the bloodline, particularly prevalent in these new, inferior populations. Suddenly, the reasons for commitment began to change. It was no longer just for the violently psychotic or the deeply melancholic. Asylums became a convenient repository for anyone deemed socially undesirable. A husband could have his inconvenient wife committed. A family, ashamed of a relative with epilepsy or a developmental disability, could have them put away. An immigrant who didn't speak English and acted strangely could be labeled insane. The legal barriers to commitment were shockingly low, often requiring only the signature of a single doctor, a doctor who might have a vested interest in keeping the asylum's beds full to justify its budget. The asylums, these grand palaces of healing, were never designed for this. Thomas Kirkbride's elegant designs, with their sunlit corridors and private rooms, were meant for a few hundred patients at most. But the population exploded. By the late 1800s, institutions built for 250 people were warehousing over 2,000. The private rooms were filled with 3, 4, 5 beds. Then the beds spilled into the hallways. Then the hallways were filled with straw mattresses on the floor. The beautiful gardens were paved over to build stark, cheap annexes. The therapeutic lectures and concerts vanished. There was no time. The farm-to-table meals were replaced by tasteless, mass-produced slop. There was no money. State legislatures, who had proudly funded the construction of these architectural marvels, grew tired of paying for their upkeep. Budgets were slashed again and again. The dream of moral treatment was expensive. Custodial care, on the other hand, was cheap. The goal was no longer to cure, but simply to contain, to manage. The asylum had transformed from a hospital into a human warehouse, a dumping ground for the unwanted, and the nature of the staff changed with it. The high-minded, reformist doctors and compassionate nurses were replaced by low-paid, untrained attendants. Often, they were people who couldn't find work anywhere else. They were given absolute power over a vulnerable and voiceless population. The therapeutic relationship between doctor and patient evaporated. In its place grew a dynamic of keeper and inmate. And in the dark, overcrowded corners of these forgotten institutions, that power curdled into cruelty. Accounts from inside began to paint a horrifying picture. Patients were beaten for minor infractions. They were locked in solitary confinement for weeks. They were restrained in brutal contraptions like the Utica crib, a coffin-like cage where a person could be held for days on end. They were subjected to hydrotherapy, which sounded benign but often meant being blasted with high-pressure fire hoses or submerged in ice-cold baths for hours until their bodies went into shock. This wasn't therapy. This was punishment. This was control. This was a system breaking under its own weight and turning on the very people it was meant to save. Dorothea Dix, the woman who had willed this system into existence, saw her life's work become a nightmare. In her later years, she witnessed the overcrowding, the neglect, the transformation of her havens into prisons. The utopia she had envisioned had become a dystopia of unimaginable scale. The failure was so complete, so catastrophic, that it forced a fundamental shift in how the medical establishment viewed mental illness itself. The early optimism of moral treatment, the belief in the power of environment and compassion, was dead. It was dismissed as naive, unscientific romanticism. A new, harder philosophy began to emerge. If insanity couldn't be cured through kindness and quiet contemplation, perhaps it wasn't a disease of the spirit at all. Perhaps it was a physical disease, a defect in the brain, a broken piece of machinery. And if the brain was just a machine, then maybe it could be fixed like one. Maybe it could be rewired. Maybe a surgeon's knife could cut away the madness. Maybe a jolt of electricity could reset the broken circuits. The focus shifted from the mind to the physical brain, from conversation to intervention. A new generation of doctors, armed with scalpels, needles, and electrodes, stood ready to wage a direct physical war on the chaos within the human skull. They were searching for a cure, a quick fix for the problem that had overwhelmed the asylum system. And in their desperation, they would unleash treatments that would make the horrors of the 19th century asylum look almost humane. The new century dawned with a promise of progress, of science conquering the darkness. But inside the asylum walls, that progress took a terrifying form. The first great hope came not from psychology, but from a Viennese physician named Manfred Sockel. In 1933, he accidentally gave a diabetic patient, who was also a morphine addict, an overdose of insulin, plunging her into a deep coma. When she awoke, her cravings were gone. A light bulb went off. Sockel theorized that by inducing a coma, he could jolt the brain, interrupting the patterns of psychosis. And so, insulin coma therapy was born. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin, their blood sugar plummeting until they convulsed and slipped into unconsciousness. They would be kept in this near-death state for an hour, sometimes longer, before being revived with a glucose solution. The process was repeated day after day for weeks. It was incredibly dangerous. The line between therapeutic coma and irreversible brain damage, or death, was razor thin. Mortality rates were as high as 10%. Yet, for a desperate medical community, the occasional report of a cured schizophrenic was enough. The treatment spread like wildfire across American asylums. It was a numbers game. If inducing a shock to the system was the key, others reasoned there had to be a faster, cheaper way to do it. A Hungarian neuropsychiatrist, Ladislas Meduna, observed incorrectly it turned out that schizophrenia and epilepsy rarely occurred in the same person. His conclusion? A seizure must be the brain's natural antidote to psychosis. He began experimenting with chemical convulsants, settling on a stimulant called metrazole. The drug induced seizures so violent they were described as explosions of terror. Patients would scream in agony as the seizure began, their muscles contracting with enough force to fracture their spine, to break their teeth, to dislocate their limbs. They were awake for the entire horrifying ordeal. The memory of the treatment was so traumatic that many patients who showed improvement refused to continue, preferring the madness to the cure. This brutality paved the way for what seemed like a more refined, more scientific approach. In Italy, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, inspired by the way slaughterhouses used electric shocks to stun pigs before slaughter, decided to apply the same principle to the human brain. In 1938, they strapped a man suffering from delusions to a table, placed electrodes on his temples, and sent a current of electricity surging through his skull. The man's body went rigid, he let out a cry, and then fell into a grand mal seizure. When he awoke, he seemed calmer, more lucid. This was the birth of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. ECT quickly supplanted the chemical and insulin-based shock therapies. It was faster, cheaper, and considered safer, though safer was a relative term. In these early days, it was administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Patients were fully conscious as the electricity hit. They experienced the full force of the seizure, the violent muscle contractions, the terror. Broken bones were common. Memory loss, both short-term and long-term, was a universal side effect. Yet, for some patients, particularly those with severe depression, it worked. The fog would lift. The suicidal despair would recede. For doctors in overcrowded, underfunded state hospitals, ECT became a miracle tool. It could quiet a violent ward, make a catatonic patient responsive, and render a difficult patient manageable. It was a tool of control as much as it was a tool of therapy. But even a medically induced seizure wasn't direct enough for some. The ultimate goal remained to physically alter the brain to cut out the disease. This idea led to the most infamous procedure in the history of psychiatry, the lobotomy. The concept was pioneered in the 1930s by a Portuguese neurologist, Agos Muniz, who theorized that by severing the connections in the brain's frontal lobes, the seat of emotion and personality, he could calm the inner turmoil of the mentally ill. His initial procedure involved drilling holes into the skull and injecting pure alcohol into the brain to destroy the nerve fibers. He later developed a special instrument called a leucotome to cut the tissue. In 1949, for this work, Agos Muniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. His procedure, however, was complex and required a neurosurgeon and an operating room. It would be an American physician who would take Muniz's brutal idea and turn it into a horrifyingly efficient, assembly line procedure. His name was Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman was a showman, a charismatic and tireless promoter of the lobotomy. He believed it was a miracle cure, and he was determined to bring it to the masses. He refined the technique, creating a procedure he could perform in minutes, right in his office, or even in a patient's home. He called it the transorbital lobotomy. The procedure was chillingly simple. Freeman would first render the patient unconscious, often with a jolt of electroshock. Then he would take a long, thin instrument, literally a reinforced ice pick from his own kitchen drawer, insert it above the patient's eyeball, through the thin bone of the eye socket. With a mallet, he would tap the ice pick into the frontal lobes of the brain. Then, he would swish the instrument back and forth, severing the connections. He would repeat the process on the other side. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Freeman became a crusader. He bought a van, which he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, and traveled across the country, from one state hospital to another, performing dozens of lobotomies a day. He was a performer, often operating with a flair for the dramatic, using both hands to operate on 2 patients at once. He performed the procedure on housewives suffering from depression, on soldiers with PTSD, on rebellious teenagers, and even on children. His youngest patient was just 4 years old. Perhaps the most famous victim of the lobotomy was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. In 1941, at the age of 23, Rosemary, who suffered from developmental delays and mood swings that embarrassed her politically ambitious family, was subjected to a lobotomy on her father's orders. The procedure was a catastrophe. It left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to speak or walk properly. She was institutionalized and hidden away from the public for the rest of her life. Rosemary's story was the story of thousands. The lobotomy didn't cure mental illness. It destroyed the personality. It blunted emotions, erased ambition, and left patients in a docile, childlike, or zombie-like state. Patients became calmer, easier to manage, which for many overworked asylum staff and desperate families, was seen as a success. Walter Freeman personally performed or supervised over 3,400 lobotomies in his career. An estimated 50,000 were performed across the United States. It was a surgical solution to a human problem, a final desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos of the mind by simply destroying the part of the brain that made a person who they were. The era of shock and steel had reached its horrifying peak. An entire generation of patients had been shocked, seized, and surgically mutilated in the name of a cure. But a quiet revolution was beginning, not in an operating theater, but in a laboratory. The age of the ice pick was coming to an end, but the age of the pill was about to begin, and it would change everything forever. The first miracle didn't look like a miracle at all. It was a synthetic dye, a bluish compound cooked up in a French pharmaceutical lab in the late 1940s. Its creators weren't looking to cure madness. They were looking for a better antihistamine, something to calm the body's allergic reactions. But in testing this new compound called chlorpromazine, they noticed a peculiar side effect. It didn't just calm rashes and sniffles. It induced a state of serene, almost detached tranquility in patients. They weren't knocked out, not sedated in the old-fashioned, brutal way. They were just calm, indifferent to their own anxieties. A French army surgeon named Henri Labret saw its potential. He used it to calm soldiers before surgery, calling it a chemical lobotomy. The name was both chillingly accurate and profoundly hopeful. It suggested the same outcome as the ice pick, but without the violence, without the irreversible destruction of the brain. The real breakthrough came in 1952. A young, severely agitated patient suffering from psychosis was given the first ever dose of chlorpromazine for a psychiatric condition. The effect was astonishing. Within hours, the man who had been thrashing, screaming, and lost in delusion became quiet. He was coherent. He was reachable. For the doctors who witnessed it, it was like watching the sun break through a storm that had raged for a lifetime. News of this miracle drug crossed the Atlantic. In 1954, it was approved in the United States under a new, powerful-sounding brand name, Thorazine. It hit the American asylum system like a tidal wave. For the first time, nurses and attendants had a tool other than straitjackets, hydrotherapy, or brute force to manage the most disturbed patients. The constant screaming on the back wards began to quiet down. Patients who had been catatonic for years, locked inside their own minds, started to speak. Those lost to violent paranoia could suddenly sit and have a meal. It wasn't a cure. The delusions might still be there, lurking beneath the surface. But the drug built a wall around them. It managed the chaos. And in the overcrowded, underfunded hellscapes of the mid-century state hospitals, managing the chaos was everything. While Thorazine was conquering the asylums, another, even stranger discovery was being made, not in a high-tech lab, but in a disused kitchen in Australia. Dr. John Cade, a psychiatrist haunted by his time as a prisoner of war, was convinced that mania, the frantic, euphoric high of what we now call bipolar disorder, was caused by some kind of toxin in the blood. He began a series of crude but ingenious experiments. He injected the urine of manic patients into guinea pigs to see if it would make them agitated. To his surprise, it did. He then began mixing the urine with different chemicals to see if he could neutralize this supposed toxin. One of the chemicals he chose, for reasons of simple chemical solubility, was lithium urate. When he injected this mixture, the guinea pigs became unnaturally calm. They were lethargic, placid. Cade, through careful follow-up tests, realized the calming effect had nothing to do with the urine or the toxin. It was the lithium, a simple basic element, a salt. In 1949, he took a risk that would be unthinkable today. He tested it on himself. Then, he gave it to a 51-year-old man who had been cycling through debilitating mania for decades, trapped in a revolving door of hospital admissions. The result was, again, miraculous. The man stabilized. He left the hospital and went back to work. John Cade had found the first effective treatment for bipolar disorder, using one of the most common elements on Earth. But in America, the medical establishment was skeptical. How could a simple, unpatentable salt be a wonder drug? It was also dangerous. The line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one was razor thin. It took over 20 years for lithium to be approved by the FDA. In that time, Thorazine and its chemical cousins had become the undisputed kings of the asylum. But the revolution wasn't just happening behind locked doors. It was happening in the manicured lawns of suburbia. The 1950s was the age of anxiety. The Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the immense social pressure to conform to a perfect cookie-cutter life. It was all taking a toll. For millions of Americans, especially women trapped in the role of the ideal housewife, the stress manifested as nervousness, insomnia, and a pervasive sense of unease. They weren't insane. They weren't candidates for an asylum, but they were suffering. And then came reprobamate. Marketed in 1955 under the brand name Milltown, it was the world's first blockbuster psychiatric drug. It was a tranquilizer, but it was different. It wasn't seen as a heavy-duty drug for psychotics. It was marketed as a gentle balm for the nerves of everyday people. It was an emotional aspirin. Hollywood stars admitted to taking it. It was featured in popular magazines. Having a Milltown prescription became a status symbol in some circles, a sign that you were sensitive and sophisticated enough to need help managing the pressures of modern life. Milltown parties became a fad. People called it Mother's Little Helper. For the first time, a psychiatric pill wasn't for them, the people locked away. It was for us. It medicalized anxiety, reframing it not as a personal failing, but as a treatable chemical imbalance. It was a profound cultural shift. Together, these drugs, Thorazine for psychosis, lithium for mania, and Miltown for anxiety, represented a new philosophy. A belief that the complex, terrifying landscape of the human mind could be tamed, managed, and reshaped through chemistry. And this new philosophy had a very practical, very powerful consequence. For 100 years, the number of patients in America's public mental hospitals had only gone up, year after year, decade after decade. The asylums were bursting at the seams, swallowing hundreds of thousands of lives. Then, in 1956, for the first time in American history, the number went down. And it kept going down. Dramatically, politicians and doctors saw their chance. These drugs, they believed, made the asylum obsolete. Why warehouse people in these massive, expensive, and often cruel institutions when they could be treated with a pill? The vision was intoxicating. They could empty the asylums. They could unlock the doors and send patients back into the world, to be cared for in a new network of community mental health centers. It was seen as a moral crusade, a triumph of science and compassion over the dark age of institutionalization. The era of deinstitutionalization had begun, but there was a dark side to the miracle. These first-generation drugs were blunt instruments. Thorazine didn't just quiet hallucinations. It often quieted the entire person, leaving them in a dull, zombified state. It had brutal physical side effects. Patients developed a slow, shuffling walk, the Thorazine shuffle. Their faces became rigid and mask-like. Most disturbing of all was tardive dyskinesia, a condition that caused uncontrollable tics, grimaces, and writhing movements of the tongue and face. It was a permanent, irreversible neurological injury, inflicted by the very drug meant to help. The chemical revolution had given doctors a powerful new weapon, but it also gave them a powerful new illusion, the illusion of a cure. The pills didn't fix the underlying problems. They suppressed the symptoms. They made patients more manageable, less disruptive. But were they making them better? Or were they just making them quiet? The great emptying of the asylums began, fueled by a potent cocktail of scientific optimism, fiscal conservatism, and a genuine desire for more humane care. The doors of institutions that had been locked for a century began to swing open. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom had known no other life, were about to be released from the wards. They were promised a future of freedom, support, and community, but as they blinked in the unfamiliar sunlight, a terrifying question hung in the air. What exactly were they being released to? The answer was supposed to be a revolution, a new era of compassion. They were being released to a network of community mental health centers, promised by the highest office in the land. President John F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary had been tragically lobotomized, signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963. It was one of the last bills he ever signed into law. The vision was beautiful, noble, and profoundly American in its optimism. No longer would the mentally ill be hidden away in decaying, overcrowded institutions. Instead, they would live among us, in their own communities, supported by a web of local clinics offering therapy, medication management, and vocational training. It was a promise of integration, of dignity, of a life beyond the ward. The federal government would provide the funds to build these centers, one for every 50,000 people, a nationwide infrastructure of care. The states, in turn, freed from the massive financial burden of running the old asylums, would fund the day-to-day operations. It was a perfect plan on paper, a dream of a more humane future. But a dream without a foundation in reality can quickly become a nightmare. The first crack in the foundation was money. The federal government allocated funds for construction, but the ongoing staffing and operational costs were left to the states. And the states, seeing an opportunity to slash their budgets, did exactly that. They eagerly shut down the expensive, crumbling asylums, celebrating the cost savings. But the money saved rarely, if ever, found its way to the new community centers. The promised network of care was never fully built. Of the 2,000 centers envisioned by Kennedy, less than half ever materialized. And those that did open were often underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed, unable to handle the complex needs of patients with severe, chronic conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The system was designed to be a bridge from the institution to the community, but the bridge was only half built, leaving a chasm. At the same time, a second revolution was happening, this one inside a pharmacy bottle. The new wave of antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine seemed like a miracle. They could quell psychosis, manage delusions, and make patients appear on the surface functional. These drugs made mass discharge from asylums possible. Policymakers and even some doctors saw them not as a tool for management but as a cure. They believed you could simply give someone a pill and send them on their way. But these were not cures. They were chemical restraints blunting symptoms but often at a terrible cost. Patients described feeling like zombies trapped in a fog, their bodies racked by side effects like uncontrollable tremors and painful muscle spasms. The medication made them manageable enough to be discharged, but it didn't equip them to navigate the complexities of life on the outside. They were released, medicated but not rehabilitated, into communities that had no resources to help them. Then came a third powerful force, the fight for civil rights. Lawyers and activists, horrified by the abuses within state hospitals, began challenging the legal basis for involuntary commitment. They argued correctly that locking someone up indefinitely simply for being different or mentally ill was a profound violation of their constitutional rights. Landmark court rulings like the 1975 Supreme Court decision in O'Connor v. Donaldson established that a state could not confine a non-dangerous individual who was capable of surviving safely in freedom by themselves or with the help of willing and responsible family members or friends. This was a monumental victory for individual liberty. It dismantled the old paternalistic system where a doctor or a family member could have you locked away with little due process. But this victory, noble and necessary as it was, had a devastating unintended consequence. In the context of a collapsing public health system, it created a perfect storm. Now it was harder than ever to compel treatment for someone in the throes of a severe psychotic episode, someone who was too ill to recognize their own need for help. The right to refuse treatment became paramount. So you had hundreds of thousands of people suffering from severe illnesses, discharged into communities with no support systems, armed with powerful but imperfect medications, and now legally protected from being reinstitutionalized unless they posed an imminent danger to themselves or others. The result was not liberation. It was abandonment. The so-called revolving door began to spin. A person would be discharged from the hospital, given a bus ticket and a 2-week supply of pills. They'd try to find housing, but with no job and a history of mental illness, no one would rent to them. They'd try to connect with a community clinic, only to find a 6-month waiting list. Their medication would run out. The symptoms would return. The voices, the paranoia, the confusion. A crisis would inevitably follow. They'd end up in a hospital emergency room, be stabilized, and then discharged right back to the same impossible situation. Or worse, they would be arrested. For trespassing because they were sleeping in a park. For disorderly conduct because they were shouting at their own hallucinations. For petty theft because they were hungry. The streets became the new asylums. Tent cities and homeless encampments swelled with people who, a generation earlier, would have been in a state hospital. They were visible to everyone, yet seen by no one. The ghosts of a failed policy, muttering to themselves on street corners, sleeping in doorways, trapped in the prison of their own minds, but now with the added horrors of exposure, hunger, and violence. And for those who were arrested, a far more sinister institution was waiting. The American prison system. Police officers with no training in mental health became the frontline responders to psychiatric crises. And county jails became the nation's new psychiatric wards. By the end of the 1970s, facilities like Rikers Island in New York and the Los Angeles County Jail were, by default, the largest mental health providers in the United States. A system designed for punishment was now tasked with care, a task for which it was catastrophically unequipped. The mentally ill were thrown into the general population, where they were preyed upon, brutalized, and punished for the symptoms of their illness. Solitary confinement, a practice known to break even the healthiest minds, became the standard tool for managing a psychotic inmate. The Great Deinstitutionalization was a policy born from a coalition of opposites. Fiscal conservatives who wanted to cut budgets, civil libertarians who wanted to protect rights, and medical optimists who believed in a pharmaceutical miracle. They all wanted the asylums gone, and they got their wish. But in their haste to tear down the old walls, they forgot to build a new home. They mistook emptying the beds for curing the patients. They celebrated freedom from the institution, but failed to provide freedom in the community. They had released hundreds of thousands of America's most vulnerable citizens from one kind of prison, only to abandon them to another, far crueler one on the streets and in the jails of a nation that had promised them everything, and then looked the other way. This catastrophic failure wasn't an accident. It was the predictable result of good intentions paved with indifference. And as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, a new political wind was about to start blowing. one that would turn this tragic abandonment into a permanent, defining feature of the American landscape. The political wind that began to blow was a gale force of fiscal conservatism. It carried with it a simple, powerful, and profoundly popular message. Government was not the solution to our problems. Government was the problem. After years of economic stagnation, inflation, and a national sense of malaise, America was ready for a change. And in 1980, that change arrived in the form of Ronald Reagan. His vision for the country was one of individual liberty, reduced taxes, and a dramatic rollback of the federal government's role in American life. Social programs seen by this new ideology as bloated, inefficient, and a drain on the economy were placed squarely on the chopping block. And among the first to feel the swing of this fiscal axe was the already crippled system of mental health care. Just 1 year earlier, in 1980, President Jimmy Carter, deeply influenced by his wife Rosalind's advocacy, had signed the Mental Health Systems Act. It was a landmark piece of legislation, the last great gasp of the community mental health movement. It was designed to finally provide the federal funding and infrastructure needed to fulfill the promise made 2 decades earlier, to build the comprehensive community support systems that were supposed to catch the thousands of patients being released from state hospitals. It was a plan to finally finish the job, but it was a promise that would never be kept. The law was passed, but before a single dollar could be appropriated for it, the political landscape shifted beneath its feet. In 1981, the Reagan administration passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or OBRA. It was a legislative behemoth designed to achieve one primary goal: cut federal spending deeply and across the board. For mental health care, OBRA was not just a budget cut, it was a demolition. It completely repealed Carter's Mental Health Systems Act, wiping it from the books as if it had never existed. In its place, it created a new system of funding: block grants. The federal government would no longer provide targeted funds for specific community mental health services. Instead, it would give lump sums of money, block grants for alcohol, drug abuse, and mental health, to the states and let them decide how to spend it. On the surface, this appealed to the conservative ideal of states' rights and local control, but the reality was a catastrophe. The new block grants came with a 25% reduction in federal funding right off the bat. States, now facing their own severe budget shortfalls, were handed a shrinking pot of money and a list of competing priorities. A dollar that could be used for mental health could just as easily be diverted to patch a pothole, hire a police officer, or fund a school program. In the brutal political arithmetic of state budgets, the mentally ill were a constituency with no voice, no lobbyists, and no power. Their needs were consistently pushed to the bottom of the list. The result was the final definitive collapse of the community mental health dream. The federal government had officially washed its hands of the problem it helped create. The already underfunded and overwhelmed community centers that did exist were now hollowed out, their budgets slashed, their staff laid off. The vital support services, case management, housing assistance, vocational training, therapy, evaporated. What deinstitutionalization had started, the policies of the 1980s finished. It severed the last thread of the national safety net, leaving the most vulnerable Americans in a free-fall. And so, the streets of American cities began to change. The revolving door of the 1970s, where patients would cycle in and out of hospitals, was replaced by something far worse: a locked door. With state hospitals continuing to downsize and community options disappearing, there was often nowhere left to go. The number of people experiencing homelessness in the United States exploded. By the mid-1980s, a hauntingly familiar figure became a fixture on urban landscapes: the disheveled person, muttering to themselves, lost in a private world of delusion, sleeping on a steam grate for warmth. This wasn't a random social phenomenon. It was a direct, predictable consequence of policy. Estimates from the time suggested that as many as a third of the nation's homeless population suffered from a severe mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They were the ghosts of a failed promise, living monuments to a system that had utterly abandoned them. But they weren't just ending up on the streets. They were ending up in jail. As communities lacked the resources to provide psychiatric care, they relied on the one system that could not say no: law enforcement. A person having a psychotic episode on a public bus was no longer a patient in need of a doctor. They were a public nuisance in need of a police officer. Minor offenses like trespassing, disorderly conduct, or shoplifting to survive became the entry point into the criminal justice system. And once inside, there was no way out. The Los Angeles County Jail, Chicago's Cook County Jail, and New York's Rikers Island swelled with inmates suffering from untreated mental illness. By the end of the decade, these facilities had, by default, become the largest psychiatric institutions in the United States. This was the birth of a new perverse phenomenon: trans-institutionalization. The mentally ill had been freed from the old asylums, only to be re-institutionalized in the concrete and steel cages of the American prison system. It was a transfer from a therapeutic model, however flawed, to a punitive one, with devastating human consequences. Yet, at the very same time this social disaster was unfolding, a revolution of a different kind was taking place in the laboratory. The 1980s saw the dawn of a new age in psychopharmacology. While the social and political structures for care were being dismantled, the biological understanding of the brain was taking incredible leaps forward. Scientists were developing a new class of antidepressant medications, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And in 1987, the FDA approved the first of this new generation, a little green and white capsule that would change the world, Prozac. Prozac and the drugs that followed were heralded as miracle cures. They seemed to have fewer of the severe side effects associated with the older generations of psychiatric drugs. They were marketed directly to doctors and eventually to the public, not just as treatments for severe depression, but as tools for self-improvement, for overcoming shyness, for becoming a better version of yourself. A new narrative took hold, one that was perfectly suited to the individualistic ethos of the era. Mental illness was simply a chemical imbalance in the brain. Your suffering wasn't a complex interplay of genetics, environment, trauma, and social factors. It was a simple, tidy biological problem, and it had a simple, tidy biological solution: a pill. This new medical model offered immense hope and relief to millions who had suffered in silence. It helped to destigmatize conditions like depression and anxiety, reframing them as legitimate medical illnesses. But it also had a profound and insidious effect on the system of care. For policymakers and insurance companies, the chemical imbalance theory was a godsend. It was far cheaper, cleaner, and more efficient to pay for a monthly prescription than it was to fund long-term therapy, supportive housing, or comprehensive community care. The pill became the perfect substitute for the system that had been destroyed. It shifted the focus from the messy, complicated work of social support to the clean, profitable work of medication management. The 1980s, therefore, ended in a state of profound and tragic paradox. As our scientific ability to treat the mind reached new heights, our social willingness to care for the person had hit rock bottom, creating a fractured, inequitable landscape of pills and prisons that would define the American approach to mental health for decades to come. And so, the question that hung in the air at the dawn of the 1980s was not if the system was broken, but how a nation so wealthy, so powerful, could allow it to shatter so completely. What does rock bottom look like? It looks like a signature. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It was a sweeping piece of legislation, part of a broader philosophy of shrinking the federal government and returning power to the states. And buried within it was a provision that effectively took a sledgehammer to the very foundation of community mental health. The act repealed President Carter's Forward-Thinking Mental Health Systems Act, the last great federal effort to build a comprehensive community-based system. In its place, the new law converted federal funding into block grants. On the surface, it sounded reasonable: give states a lump sum of money and the flexibility to use it as they saw fit. But in reality, it was a death sentence for the community mental health movement. The money came with fewer strings attached, and in an era of deep tax cuts and shrinking state budgets, local governments faced impossible choices: fund a new crisis stabilization unit, or repair a crumbling bridge; hire a case manager for a dozen people with schizophrenia, or keep a fire station from closing. The funding intended for the most vulnerable members of society was suddenly in direct competition with every other public need. And predictably, tragically, mental health care lost. The federal government had washed its hands of the problem, and the states, now under-resourced and overwhelmed, simply could not fill the void. The floor that had been promised to catch those falling out of the asylums had just been ripped out from under them. The result was a human catastrophe played out in slow motion on the streets of every American city. The asylum walls had been torn down, but instead of finding a community with open arms, hundreds of thousands of people with severe mental illness found only the cold indifference of the sidewalk. The homeless population in the United States exploded. Suddenly, the faces of this crisis were not the able-bodied men of the Great Depression, but people visibly struggling with psychosis, with crippling depression, with the ghosts of trauma. They were left to navigate a world without structure, without support, and without medication. For them, freedom from the asylum was simply the freedom to be cold, to be hungry, and to be afraid. And for those who couldn't survive on the streets, another institution was waiting. An institution with walls even higher and doors that locked even tighter. The American prison system. With the collapse of public mental health services, police officers became the nation's de facto first responders for psychiatric crises. They were untrained, unequipped, and put in an impossible position. A person having a psychotic break was no longer met with a doctor, but with a badge and a gun. Behaviors that were symptoms of an illness, disorderly conduct, trespassing, vagrancy were now crimes. And so the Great Migration began. We didn't close the asylums, we just outsourced them. To sheriffs, to corrections officers, to the concrete and steel of a prison cell. By the end of the 20th century, the three largest mental health facilities in the United States were not hospitals. They were jails: Los Angeles County, Chicago's Cook County, and New York City's Rikers Island. Each housed more mentally ill individuals than any remaining psychiatric institution in the country. We had traded the back wards for cell blocks, the straitjacket for solitary confinement. It was a spectacular failure of public policy, a moral stain hidden behind bars, creating a vicious cycle. An individual would get arrested, serve a short sentence without receiving any meaningful treatment, and be released back to the streets, often with just a bus token and a few dollars. Their condition would inevitably worsen, leading to another crisis, another arrest, and another incarceration. The revolving door of the old state hospitals had been replaced by the revolving door of the county jail. But from these ruins, from this landscape of neglect and criminalization, something powerful began to grow. A rebellion. It wasn't led by doctors or politicians. It was led by the very people the system had discarded. They were mothers and fathers who were tired of watching their children cycle in and out of jails. They were brothers and sisters who refused to accept that a life on the streets was the only option. And most importantly, they were the individuals who had lived through the system themselves. They began to organize. In 1979, a small group of families founded what would become the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, creating a grassroots force for advocacy. And a new language began to emerge. People with psychiatric diagnoses started to reject the passive, helpless label of patient. They adopted new terms, consumer, signifying that they were active participants in their own care. Psychiatric survivor, a term that defiantly highlighted their resilience in the face of a brutal system. This was more than just semantics, it was a civil rights movement. It was a fight for self-determination, for dignity, for a voice. They argued that their lived experience was a form of expertise just as valid as a medical degree. They championed the idea of recovery, not as a cure, but as a personal journey of rebuilding a meaningful life despite the presence of a mental illness. They demanded an end to forced treatments and seclusion, calling for peer support programs where people could help each other heal. For the first time, the people who had been talked about for centuries were now demanding to be the ones doing the talking. While this human rights movement was bubbling up from below, another revolution was happening from the top down, in the pristine laboratories of neuroscience. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush declared it the decade of the brain. Billions of dollars in federal funding poured into research. New technologies like PET scans and functional MRIs allowed scientists to peer inside the living human brain for the first time, to watch it light up with thought and emotion. The old Freudian theories of bad parenting and repressed memories were swept away by a tidal wave of biology. Mental illness, the science now declared, was a brain disease, a tangible, physical, biological disorder just like diabetes or heart disease. This had a profound impact. On one hand, it was a powerful weapon against stigma. It wasn't a moral failing. It was a chemical imbalance. This new framework gave millions of people a way to understand their suffering that didn't involve shame. But it also had a downside. It reduced incredibly complex human experiences, grief, trauma, despair, to a simple neurochemical equation. The person was getting lost in the focus on the brain. This biological revolution coincided with the arrival of a new class of drugs that would change the world: selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And the first of them was a cultural icon, a little green and white capsule called Prozac. Approved in 1987, Prozac was marketed not just as a treatment for severe depression, but as a personality enhancer. It landed on the cover of Newsweek and was hailed as a wonder drug. It had fewer of the severe side effects of the older antidepressants and was seen as safer and easier to prescribe. Millions of Americans who would never have considered themselves mentally ill started taking it for everything from general anxiety to shyness. It promised not just to make you well, but to make you better than well. And so, as the 20th century drew to a close, the American landscape of mental health was a study in stark, bewildering contradictions. On the streets and in the prisons, the system had utterly collapsed, creating a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. At the same time, a powerful advocacy movement was demanding that the human rights and dignity of individuals be placed at the center of all treatment. And in the labs and pharmacies, a biological revolution was promising a quick fix, a simple pill to rebalance a complex brain. These three forces, systemic collapse, human rights, and biochemical intervention, were on a collision course. The nation had a deeper understanding of the brain than ever before, more powerful drugs than at any point in history, and a growing chorus of voices demanding humane care. So why, for the most vulnerable, were things about to get even worse? The answer, like so many moments in this story, began with a noble idea. An idea born from the highest office in the land. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary had been tragically lobotomized, stood before Congress and declared a new path forward. He called for a bold new approach to mental illness, one that would replace the cold, distant state hospitals with a network of comprehensive community mental health centers. The goal was to bring care out of the shadows and into the mainstream, to treat people not as inmates but as neighbors. It was a vision of compassion, of progress, of civil rights. This movement had a name: deinstitutionalization, and it would become one of the most catastrophic social policy failures in American history. The great emptying of the asylums didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of a perfect storm, a confluence of three powerful forces, each pushing in the same direction. The first was pharmacological. The new antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine were hailed as miracle cures. The thinking was simple and dangerously optimistic. If you could control the most severe symptoms with a pill, you no longer needed the massive, expensive institutions to warehouse people. Patients could live freely, manage their illness with medication, and integrate back into society. The asylum, with its high walls and locked doors, was seen as an archaic relic that modern science had made obsolete. The second force was legal. A wave of patients' rights lawsuits swept the country. Activists, lawyers, and civil libertarians argued correctly that people were being stripped of their basic human rights, committed to institutions against their will, often for life, with little to no actual treatment. Landmark court cases established new standards. A state couldn't just lock someone away for being different or difficult. To be involuntarily committed, a person had to be proven to be an imminent danger to themselves or to others. This raised the bar for commitment so high that it became nearly impossible for families or doctors to get help for someone in the grips of a severe psychotic episode, unless they had already become violent. The doors of the asylums, once locked tight, were now legally pried open. But the third force, the one that truly sealed the fate of the system, was economic. And it was brutally cynical. State governments were groaning under the immense financial weight of maintaining these sprawling hospital campuses. Deinstitutionalization presented them with a golden opportunity. By closing the state hospitals, they could slash their budgets and shift the financial burden of care onto the federal government. The plan was that federal programs, like Medicaid and Social Security disability insurance, would provide income and health coverage for the newly discharged patients. The states would save billions, and the federal government, along with local communities, would pick up the tab for the new network of community care centers. Seemed like a win-win, but the promise was a lie. The community mental health centers that President Kennedy had envisioned were never built, not on the scale that was needed. His vision died with him in Dallas. The funding that was supposed to materialize from the federal government was siphoned off by the escalating war in Vietnam and other national priorities. The states, having successfully shed their most expensive budget item, had no political will to invest in new, robust community services. They simply took the savings and ran. And so the exodus began. From the late 1960s through the 1980s, the populations of state mental hospitals plummeted. In 1955, there were over 550,000 patients in these institutions. By the 1990s, there were fewer than 70,000. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom had known no other life than the structured, if often miserable, world of the asylum, were discharged. They were given a bus ticket, a small supply of medication, and a referral to a community clinic that often didn't exist, or was overwhelmed and underfunded. They were released not into the arms of a caring community, but into a void, The consequences were immediate and devastating. A new term entered the American lexicon: the revolving door syndrome. Patients, unable to cope on their own, would stop taking their medication, spiral into crisis, and end up in a hospital emergency room. They'd be stabilized over a few days and then discharged right back to the same impossible situation, only to repeat the cycle again and again. For tens of thousands, the final destination was the street. The explosion of homelessness that began in the 1980s was not a coincidence. It was a direct and predictable result of deinstitutionalization. Walk through the downtown of any major American city today, and you are walking through the ruins of this failed policy. You are witnessing the ghosts of the asylum. But people with untreated severe mental illness didn't just end up on the streets. They ended up in jail. Their symptoms, paranoia, delusions, disorganized behavior, were no longer seen through a medical lens, but through a criminal one. Police officers, with little to no training in mental health, became the frontline responders to psychiatric crises. And the only tool they had was a pair of handcuffs. The result was the mass criminalization of the mentally ill. We didn't solve the problem of the asylum, we just outsourced it to the penal system. Consider this staggering fact. Today, the three largest mental health providers in the United States are not hospitals. They are jails: Cook County Jail in Chicago, Rikers Island in New York City, and the Los Angeles County Jail. These facilities hold more mentally ill individuals than any remaining psychiatric hospital in the country. We traded the long-term wards of state hospitals for the concrete cells of the county jail. We replaced straitjackets with solitary confinement. We told ourselves we were freeing people, that we were acting out of compassion and respect for civil rights. But for the sickest and most vulnerable, we simply swapped one institution for another, one that was far less equipped to provide care and far more prone to violence and trauma. The final nail in the coffin came in 1981, when the Reagan administration passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. This law effectively ended the federal government's direct role in providing services for the mentally ill. It took the remaining meager funding for community mental health centers and converted it into block grants for the states, which came with fewer strings attached and significant cuts. States were now free to use that money on virtually anything they wanted. And in an era of tax cuts and fiscal conservatism, mental health services were always the first on the chopping block. The noble dream of community care was officially dead. The nation had closed the book on the era of the Great Asylum, but in doing so, it had created a new, more insidious crisis. A crisis of neglect played out not behind high walls, but in plain sight on our sidewalks, in our libraries, and in our prisons. We had torn down the old system, convinced of its evils, but had failed utterly to build anything in its place. The great emptying of the asylums was complete. The nation had turned its back on its most vulnerable citizens, leaving them to fend for themselves in a world that didn't understand them. The result was a catastrophe that haunts our cities to this day. And as the 20th century came to a close, a new epidemic was quietly gathering storm, one that would once again redefine America's relationship with the mind and challenge the very soul of its healthcare system. That storm arrived not in a flash of lightning, but in the quiet rattle of a pill bottle. It began in the Rust Belt towns and hollowed-out communities left behind by the global economy. Here, in the heart of American despair, doctors began prescribing powerful new opioid painkillers for everything from a bad back to a broken heart. Drugs like OxyContin were marketed with a promise: a life without pain. But for millions, they delivered a different kind of life sentence. The opioid crisis wasn't just a crisis of addiction. It was a crisis of mental health, disguised as a physical ailment. The pain these drugs were meant to treat was often not just in the body, but in the soul. A deep, aching loneliness, a loss of purpose, a grief for a life that was supposed to be different. The pharmaceutical industry had, wittingly or not, monetized despair. And as prescriptions soared, so did overdoses. A generation was lost, not to a visible plague, but to a silent one, a disease of despair, that also saw suicide rates and deaths from alcoholism climb to staggering new heights. America, it seemed, was suffering a collective spiritual sickness, and its primary treatment was a pill that promised oblivion. At the dawn of the 21st century, another revolution was taking place, this one not in a pharmacy, but in our pockets and on our desks. The internet and later social media promised to connect us all, to build a global village that would banish loneliness forever. It did connect us, but it also created new, unforeseen pressures on the human psyche. We were suddenly living two lives. One in the physical world, and another on a screen, a curated, filtered reality where everyone else's life seemed perfect. This digital stage created a culture of constant comparison, a relentless performance of happiness that left millions feeling inadequate, anxious, and more isolated than ever. The very architecture of these platforms, the likes, the shares, the endless scroll, was designed to hijack our brain's reward systems, creating behavioral addictions that mirrored substance abuse. For teenagers navigating the already treacherous waters of adolescence, it was a minefield of cyberbullying, body dysmorphia, and a pervasive fear of missing out. The tool that promised to bring us together was, for many, driving us further apart, creating a new kind of asylum with invisible walls, where the patient and the warden were one and the same. And then the world stopped. The COVID-19 pandemic was a global health crisis, but it was also the largest, most sudden mental health experiment in human history. The lockdowns, the social distancing, the fear of an invisible enemy, it was a collective trauma. The thin veils of routine and distraction that kept our anxieties at bay were ripped away. We were forced to sit with ourselves, with our families, and with our thoughts in a way we never had before. And for many, what we found in that silence was terrifying. Rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation skyrocketed. The demand for mental health services exploded overnight. The crisis laid bare a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Our mental health infrastructure was completely, catastrophically unprepared. There weren't enough therapists, not enough hospital beds, not enough resources. The system, already strained to its breaking point, simply shattered. But from the ashes of that crisis, something new began to emerge. Forced into isolation, we turned to the very technology that had, in some ways, caused our distress. Telehealth, once a niche service, became the primary mode of care. Suddenly, therapy wasn't something you had to drive to, take time off work for, and sit in a waiting room to receive. It was available on your phone, in your living room, on your own terms. This digital revolution in care dramatically lowered the barrier to entry. It offered a degree of privacy and convenience that was previously unimaginable, reaching people in rural areas or those with mobility issues who had been left behind. And as millions sought help, a cultural shift that had been slowly building for years finally reached a tipping point. The stigma surrounding mental illness began to crumble. Public figures, athletes, and celebrities started speaking openly about their struggles with depression and anxiety. On platforms like TikTok and Instagram, a new generation of young people talked about therapy, medication, and mental health with a candor that was both shocking and revolutionary. It was no longer a shameful secret to be hidden away. It was a shared part of the human experience. Yet, as we stand here today, in the wake of so much change, the story of mental health in America remains a tale of two realities. For those with wealth and good insurance, there is an ever-expanding universe of options. Specialized therapies, wellness retreats, and apps that promise mindfulness at the touch of a button. But for the poor, the marginalized, and the uninsured, the reality is starkly different. For them, the emergency room is often the only option for a crisis, and the most likely place to receive long-term mental health care is not a hospital, but a jail cell. Our nation's prisons and jails have become our new asylums, warehousing hundreds of thousands of individuals whose primary crime is being sick in a society that has failed them. The promise of the Mental Health Parity Act, which mandated that insurance cover mental illness as it does physical illness, often feels like a cruel joke in the face of endless denials and bureaucratic red tape. We have a desperate shortage of psychiatrists and therapists, especially those who serve children and underserved communities. The pendulum, it seems, is always swinging. The history of mental health care in America is not a straight line of progress. It is a circle, a repeating cycle of moral panics and heartfelt reforms, of scientific breakthroughs and societal neglect. We built the asylums to offer moral treatment, then abandoned them when they became monuments to our own cruelty. We discovered powerful medications that promised to liberate the mind, only to see them become chemical straitjackets. We deinstitutionalized with the noble dream of community care, but failed to build the community, leaving the most vulnerable to fend for themselves on the streets. From the chains of the colonial cellar to the algorithms of the smartphone, we have been endlessly searching for the right way to care for the troubled mind. We have learned so much, yet we still struggle with the most fundamental questions. What do we owe one another? How do we balance individual freedom with the collective good? And how do we build a society that doesn't just treat mental illness, but fosters mental wellness? The asylum on the hill may be gone, its windows dark and its halls empty, but its ghost is still with us. It lives in our overflowing prisons, in our homeless encampments, in the silent struggles behind closed doors. The story is not over. The work is not done. The great American experiment, not just in governance, but in understanding the complexities of our own minds, continues.